How y'all doing? I'm the Watchman, and this video right here is entitled "The Sin That Started the Devil's Downfall." The sin that caused the devil's downfall. Now, I had to ask myself, as I look at churches, and I look at many different people of many different denominations, teachers of the word. I see that the characteristics in the life of the devil is not taught. And God said, He distinctly says, keep thy friends close, but thy enemies closer. Meaning you have to get to know your enemy. If you don't, the less you know about the devil, the more power he has over you. The less you know about him, the more power he has over you. And if you don't know your enemy, if you do not know your enemy, how can you fight against him? Think about it. If you do not know your enemy, what he does, how he thinks, how he moves, then you can't fight against him. So this one right here, this series that we're gonna do is about the life and characteristics of the devil and why and how he fell from grace. And why he fell from grace. Could it be that the very sin that started the devil's downfall is the major plug, the major sin that's running rampant throughout us all nowadays? And like my fellow sister is in accordance with, could it be, y'all, and I'm gonna do another video on this, but the devil is alive and in flesh, walking around amongst us, amongst our world kings and leaders right now, for we are in trying and troubled times, and he is alive and in flesh, walking around amongst us. But that's a whole nother video, part series. First, let's see who he is and why he fell from grace. All right. First off, we know. And by the way, my fellow sister, Lilith, she has a great channel, Lilith TV. Lilith TV is her YouTube channel. But anyway, let's get started. Lucifer wanted to be his own God. We know this. He wanted to be his own God. But he did not wake up one morning just out the blue and say, you know what? I want to be my own God. There was a gradual downfall to this point. Let's see where it started. First off, he took his eyes off of his creator. He took his eyes off of God, and he kept them on himself. He took his eyes off of God, and he kept them on himself. Turning your Bibles with me to Ezekiel. Let's go to Ezekiel 28. Ezekiel 28. Now, Ezekiel 28, verses 14 through 19 talks about the devil and tells about his character. His God is talking to the devil. But we're going to read verse 17. Ezekiel 28, and we're going to start at verse 17. Thine heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness. I will cast thee to the ground. I will lay thee before kings, that they may behold thee. Let me say it again. Thy heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness. Like I said, he took his eyes off of God and he placed them on himself. He was doing what we basically call today, he was feeling himself. Ain't that crazy? That's in songs nowadays. In the movies, from songs to movies to TV shows. It's all right to feel yourself. Do you? He was feeling himself like, ooh, look at me. Ooh, look at me. Like it says, because of thy beauty, you know what I mean? Thy wisdom was corrupted. He was feeling himself. He took his eyes off of God and kept them on himself. My beloved, this was the creation of self-righteousness. This was the creation and start of self-righteousness. It's almost like there's a war between two letters. And I'll explain this letter later. But one of the letters is the letter U, and the letter I. The letter U and the letter I. Now this was the creation of the letter I. You know, in the word we, W-E, there is no I. The word us, U-S, there is no I. In the word you, Y-O-U, there is no I. The word love, L-O-V-E, there is no I. This was the creation of the letter I. The letter I. I'll explain that later. Alright, now look. The law, God's law, is the character of God. If you want to know how God's character is, it's found in his law. You know, that's why that's the main purpose of his law. You know, he wants to shape our characters more into the accordance of his character. You know. Now, God is the character. God's law is his character. God's law is his character. So knowing that, now we see why there's so many attacks upon God's law. You know, if you honestly look at it, follow with me, my brothers and sisters, that if we know that the law is God's character, and the more you work on the law, the closer to God's character you become. Now it should make more sense to why there's a motto and sayings going out throughout the Christian world today of you don't need God's law. Well, we're going to see where that spirit really came from. That spirit started with Satan. You don't need God's law. Why? Because like Satan knows, God's law is his character. Now, Peter in second Peter, Peter warns us to not take Paul's writings out of context. A lot of people, and the devil has used something that Paul said to take out of context. Now Peter says that he warns against it. He says Paul's writings can be easily misunderstood. And when Paul stated, for we are not under law, but under the law of grace, what Paul really meant, I'm gonna do a quick summary real quick. What Paul really meant was, it's like you have a ladder. Grace is like the fourth prong up here on the ladder. Now to get up to the fourth prong on the ladder, you gotta climb. You gotta climb. So the law actually is like the second prong. So so when Paul says you're under grace, when you reach that point in your Christian walk, beloved, that you're under grace, you've already walked along that prong. You've already climbed up that prong of the law. So that's why he says you're no longer under the law, but you're under the law of grace, because the law is in your heart now. Because you've reached a certain plateau. It didn't see, nowadays the devil have people thinking when they say, oh, nah, we're not under the law, we're under grace. See, now they're just trying to jump and grab on to the plateau of grace without climbing first. You got to climb. You can't skip levels. It's like a video game. Before you get to the big boss man, or before you reach, you got to go through certain levels to finish the game. That's what Paul was talking about. And one of the levels is the law. The law is one of the first levels. So once you reach the level of grace, you've already conquered the level of the law. So the law is inside of you. That's why Paul says you're no longer under the law, because it's already inside of you, instilled in you, once you reach that level of grace. For if the law isn't instilled in you, then you haven't reached that level of grace yet. And that's where the devil comes in. He wants people to think that they could just jump and reach that level of grace by skipping over God's law. And we all know you can't just run and jump and grab up on a ladder. You can. You either gonna fall, slip, prongs, your feet ain't gonna catch balance. But basically, beloved, you gotta reach certain levels. You gotta conquer certain levels to climb. You gotta conquer certain levels to climb. You just can't run and jump and reach up on that plateau. But that is the trick that the devil has a lot of people doing. Why? Because that is what he first started doing in heaven. Because he knows that God's character is his law. And the more he can keep your mind off of the law, the more less like God you will be. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so when Lucifer, now bear with me. Now when Lucifer So when Lucifer took his eyes off of God, that automatically took his eyes off of the law. Now there is no I in the Ten Commandments. There is no I in the law of God. Let me explain. See, the first 4 commandments are based on your duty towards God and how you please God. The first 4 commandments are based on your duty and how you're supposed to please God. And the last 6 commandments are based on your duty towards men, your brothers and sisters. You see what I'm saying? There is no I. There is no commandment to take care of yourself. There is no commandment that has you focusing on self. The first 4 is your duty towards God, and the last 6 is your duty towards man. There is no I in the 10 commandments. There is no I in the law of God. Turn with me to Isaiah 14. Isaiah 14, and we're going to read verse 12. We're going to start at verse 12. Isaiah 14, and we're going to start at verse 12. God is describing Lucifer again. God is describing Satan again. I want you to count with me how many times you hear the word, the letter I, the word I, in describing Lucifer. Okay, Isaiah 14, verse 12. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregations in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. That's 5 times, y'all. Y'all, that's crazy, ain't it? And even in the description of Lucifer, 5 times he states I. That's all you hear out of his mouth is I. The creation of the letter I. Self-righteousness. Now, self-righteousness, is basically saying, self-righteousness is basically saying that what Lucifer was saying was he did not need God's law to be a good angel. See, he didn't start off all corrupt and wickedness. He like we read in Ezekiel 28, because his beauty had corrupted him. He was like, man, look at me. Look at me, I don't need to do God's law. I don't need God's law to tell me I'm good. I don't need to follow his law to be a good angel. Ooh. When you think about it, today, brothers and sisters, haven't you heard it? You just heard it put a different way. I don't need God's law to be a good Christian. I don't need to follow God's law, to be saved. Don't people say all the time, I don't have to go to church to be saved. I don't have to keep Saturday as the commandment to be saved, as the Sabbath. Where did that come from? It started in heaven, y'all. Pray, fast, and think about honestly what I'm telling you. The devil fell because of self-righteousness. And self-righteousness is saying, that letter, I can create my own rules and laws to live by. I do not have to go by God's rules or God's commandments. I can create my own commandments. And now the devil has took Paul's writing, which Peter warns about in 2 Peter. The exact verse skips my mind, but I'm gonna tell it in part 2 of this series, in part 2, where Peter warns that Paul's writings can be taken out of context. That was God warning us that Paul's writings, it can be easily taken out of context. For the devil wants people to just skip over the levels. Remember, you have to conquer each level before you just reach the level where you're free under grace. To reach that level, you first have to conquer the level of instilling God's law, his character, in your heart. I. The beginning of self-righteousness. Now, honestly, think about it. How many times have we heard other Christians say, I don't need God's law to be a good Christian. Well, that is what the devil was saying. He said he didn't need God's law to be a good angel.